The night started off great, but by the end, it felt like a bit of a waste of time. It was the annual gala at the Carmichael estate, an event that was so over the top that even the champagne seemed to mock you. Lauren had been talking about it for weeks. "It's a huge opportunity for my career," she said, her voice full of excitement. Lauren always had a knack for the grandiose. She knew how to command the room, drawing people in with her charm as if Lauren was born to be the hostess. But there was something off about the evening. It wasn't something you could put your finger on, just a feeling that something was off. She made a few little mistakes here and there, like a misstep or two, and her laugh lingered a little too long at some jokes. She avoided making eye contact with me, and there was a brief expression on her face when she thought no one was watching. I decided not to dwell on it. She'd been under a lot of stress lately, and there wasn't anything I could point to as a reason. So I poured another glass of wine and tried to enjoy myself. Then, about halfway through the night, Lauren left. I didn't think much of it at first. I figured she was probably dealing with something last minute, but when 20 minutes turned into an hour, I started to wonder if there was more to it. I texted her, but she didn't reply. I called and got straight to voicemail, and that's when I saw him. He was tall, sharp-jawed, and had a kind of charm that made people smile back. He was one of the sponsors of the event I'd seen Lauren talking to earlier. Now he was making his way through a side hallway, moving deliberately, as if he didn't want to be seen. I decided to follow him. The hallway led to a quieter part of the estate where the party noise had died down to a faint buzz. I stopped, but my gut was telling me to turn back. Instead, I was drawn forward by curiosity, or perhaps something deeper. I noticed a door at the end of the hall was slightly ajar. I heard voices inside. It was a his and hers situation. I couldn't make out the words, but there was something intimate in the tone. It made my skin prickle. I edged closer. My heart was beating fast. I heard a loud noise like a drum, and then I heard her voice, but it wasn't words or even conversation. It was her voice breaking into soft, breathy moans. My chest tightened, and I felt a sinking feeling in my stomach. My hand was on the doorknob, and I was tempted to just go in and ask what was going on. But my legs felt like they were made of stone, and I couldn't move. Then my phone buzzed in my pocket, cutting through the silence. I reached for my phone without thinking. "Hey, are you okay?" she asked. Her voice was calm and casual. "I love you, you know." Her tone was so calm and collected that for a moment I thought I'd imagined everything. But my ears were still ringing from the sound I'd just heard. I swallowed hard and asked, "Where are you?" My voice was shaky, and I could tell she was trying to make it sound like she was just wrapping things up with a client. She said she'd find me in a bit, and then she hung up. She ended the call before I could respond. I was looking at the screen. My hands were shaking a bit, and my mind was racing. This was the first time in years that she'd done this to me. I felt like I was looking at a stranger, and I couldn't decide what terrified me more, that she was lying to me or that she didn't seem to care if I believed her. I didn't go back to the main event. Instead, I stood there in the dim hallway, the phone still in my hand, her words echoing in my head. "You know I love you, right?" How could she sound so calm and unbothered when I was just a few feet away from what sounded like betrayal? The door at the end of the hall closed with a creak, and I instinctively moved against the wall. I heard two sets of footsteps following me. One was hers. I'd recognize those heels anywhere. The other set of footsteps was heavier and more deliberate. I glanced around the corner just in time to see Lauren and him. They didn't see me. They were too engrossed in their discussion to notice me. They were either deep in discussion or, more likely, ignoring each other. They exchanged a brief, meaningful glance as they walked back toward the crowd, his hand brushing against her lower back. She didn't react at all. I wanted to confront her right then and there, but something held me back. It wasn't fear. It was something more sinister. I wanted to know how far this went and how deep the issue had been buried before I realized it was affecting me. Over the next hour, I kept an eye on her as I moved through the crowd. She acted like nothing had happened, laughing too loudly at jokes and charming the guests, playing the part of the perfect host. But there were moments when she glanced over her shoulder, her eyes searching, not for me or him, but for something else. The centerpiece of the evening was an auction. Lauren, who was in charge of the show, took the stage to announce the evening's prizes. As she spoke, She filled the room with her voice. She was radiating warmth and excitement, and the crowd loved her. I watched her from the back of the room, thinking about what I'd heard in the hallway. That's when I felt a hand on my shoulder. "Eric," I said, turning to see a woman in her mid-30s with striking red hair and a curious look in her eyes. "I'm Stephanie," she said, in a low voice. "We haven't had the chance to meet officially, but I've heard a lot about you." "Yeah," I replied, a little stiffly. "I'm Lauren's husband." Her lips twitched into a thin smile, but there was something off about it. She leaned in slightly and lowered her voice. "You're a patient man. What do you mean by that?" I asked, feeling a little uneasy. She paused, looking around as if to make sure no one was listening. "I've seen how she treats him," she said, choosing her words carefully. "You deserve to know." My heart was beating hard against my ribs. "Who are you referring to?" "Bryce," she said, nodding toward the tall guy from earlier, the one who had been looking into the hallway with Lauren. "He's been friends with her for a few months now." I didn't want to say anything, but she trailed off, leaving the unspoken words hanging between us. My throat felt a bit dry. "Why are you sharing this with me?" Stephanie's expression softened. "I've been in your shoes," she said. "I wasn't informed until it was too late." I didn't respond. My mind was racing with a mix of emotions: anger, disbelief, and a sickening sense of clarity, before I could ask anything else. I heard applause and looked up to see Lauren stepping down from the stage. She was radiant, basking in the attention. I hated how much I still wanted to believe in her, even now. But it was a seed that had been planted. Stephanie's words, the sounds from the hallway, and Bryce's hand on Lauren's back all pointed to the same devastating truth as Lauren approached me. She was smiling, looking as radiant as ever, and she slipped her arm around mine like nothing had happened. "You've been so quiet tonight. How are you holding up?" Her eyes met mine, but not with concern. It was as if she was checking to see if I knew or had figured it out. I gave a forced smile. "Actually, I was lying. I was just enjoying the party." She gave me a big, warm smile. "Good, let's get out there and mingle." Then, as she led me back into the crowd, I glanced over my shoulder. I noticed that Bryce was watching us. His expression was pretty intense. I had a feeling this wasn't going to end well. The ride home was quiet, but not in a relaxed way. It was the kind of silence that made every sound seem louder, like the hum of the car engine or the occasional blip of her phone. Lauren was checking her messages, her face illuminated by the glow of her phone screen. I kept my eyes on the road and gripped the steering wheel tightly, my knuckles hurting. "You were quiet tonight," she finally said, breaking the silence. "I was watching you like a dull knife, busy trying to keep up with how good you were at your job." I replied in a neutral tone. She laughed as if that was a compliment. Overall, it was a good night. I think we got it just right. When we pulled into the driveway, the word "we" hung in the air like smoke. Lauren gave me a quick kiss on the cheek before getting out of the car. "I'm going to take a shower," she said, heading into the house. I stayed in the car, letting the events of the evening take over. "Just to give you a heads up," Steffi said. I could hear Bryce's hand on her back and the muffled sounds behind the door. I didn't want to look at it, but I couldn't ignore it. After a few minutes, I went inside. The house was pretty quiet, except for the sound of running water upstairs. I really should have gone to bed, but instead I found myself wandering into the kitchen. I poured myself a drink, whiskey neat, and stood there staring at the darkened window. I looked in the mirror and saw my reflection staring back at me. My thoughts were interrupted by a soft, buzzing sound. It was her phone. I found it on the counter where she'd left it. The screen lit up with a message. I knew I shouldn't take a look. I told myself to walk away. I didn't want to be that guy. But curiosity or desperation. The message preview read, "Bryce, you're amazing. I'm looking forward to the next time." My hand was shaking as I unlocked her phone. I knew the password. It was our anniversary. As it turned out, the messages were right there. It was like a trail of breadcrumbs, leading straight to the truth. "Bryce, tonight was great." "Lauren, I couldn't stop thinking about you the whole time." "Bryce, you're a bit addictive. When can we get away again?" I had this weird, cold feeling in my chest, like my ribs had been replaced with ice. I kept scrolling. I felt my heart sink with every word. This wasn't just casual flirting. It was well-planned, coordinated, and detailed. There were also photos. There was even a photo of her in that same crimson dress, taken from an angle that made me feel uneasy. It was another photo of him without a shirt. His smirk was taunting me, even though I couldn't see his face. I was stopped in my tracks by the sound of water upstairs. I locked the phone and put it back where I found it. I felt like I'd burned my hands just by touching it. A minute later, Lauren came downstairs. Her hair was wrapped in a towel, and her face was glowing from the steam. "What are you doing up?" she asked. She sounded upbeat and playful. I looked at her. I was still thinking about the messages I just read. The way she laughed with Bryce earlier in the night made it clear she had no idea I knew. I told her I just needed a drink. She strolled over and leaned against the counter. Her towel slipped a bit, showing off the delicate curve of her collarbone. All I could think about was her lips pressed against his skin. "You're acting a little strange," she said, tilting her head with that teasing smile she always used to disarm me. "Everything okay?" I felt like I needed to have a chat with her. I wanted to check in and see how she was doing. I wanted to throw the phone at her and demand answers, but instead I took a sip of my drink and shrugged. "I'm fine," she said, narrowing her eyes at me. Then, as if deciding I wasn't worth the effort, she kissed my cheek again. "Don't stay up too late," she said. I watched her walk away up the stairs and out of sight. I clenched my jaw as I replayed her words in my mind. "You're amazing. I'm looking forward to the next time." I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep going. The next morning, Lauren was in a great mood as she sat at the kitchen island, enjoying her coffee. She looked like the woman I'd fallen in love with, but I knew better. Every smile, every touch, every word felt somehow wrong. I couldn't look at her without thinking of Bryce or seeing the messages burned into my memory. "I've got a new client coming in this afternoon," she said, swirling her spoon in her coffee. "It's a great chance for us. I'll probably be home late." I could tell from her expression that she was surprised by my question. "Can you tell me who the client is?" She looked up at me, clearly surprised by my question. I repeated the question, keeping my tone neutral. "Who are you meeting with?" She gave a little wave, as if to say it was just a preliminary meeting. "I figured you wouldn't know them." She was pretty good at it. If I hadn't seen the texts, I might have believed her. "She sounds pretty important," I said, taking a sip of my coffee. "She is," she replied. Her voice was bright and cheerful. A beat, then a sigh. "This sounds pretty serious." "It is. Can you meet me in an hour and bring your car? I'll fill you in on everything then." An hour later, we were parked 2 blocks away from a downtown cafe. Jake was driving while I looked around on the sidewalk. Lauren's car was already there, along with Bryce's. "We were keeping an eye on your wife." "I need to know what really happened," Jake said. He sounded a mix of surprised and worried, but he didn't push back. He knew better than to push me when I was like this. A few minutes later, Lauren and Bryce came out of the cafe, laughing as they walked to his car. I got a queasy feeling in my stomach. They didn't seem like they were there to talk about work. They looked like they were up to something else. I suggested, "Let's follow them." I spoke quietly. Jake took a moment, then started the car. "You sure about this?" "I've never been more certain." I watched as they got into Bryce's sleek car. We followed them in a black sedan, keeping a safe distance. They stopped at a boutique hotel, a small, discreet place tucked away from Main Street. Lauren stepped out first, looking around as if she were a thief in the night. Then Bryce joined her, giving her a little nudge at the small of her back as they went inside. I felt my chest tighten with a mix of anger and heartbreak. Jake shot me a look, his jaw clenched. "Stay here," I said, opening the door. "What are you planning to do?" Jake asked. His voice was filled with concern. "I'm not sure yet." "I can't just sit here," I said. I didn't wait around for his answer. My legs felt a bit heavy as I walked toward the hotel. My heart was beating fast with every step. I didn't have a plan in place. I just had this feeling that I needed to confront her and get to the truth. The air was cool and had a faint lavender scent. The receptionist barely looked at me as I walked past the desk toward the elevators. I didn't know which room they were in, but I had a feeling I'd find out soon enough. As I stood in the elevator, I felt the weight of the moment. This is it. This is where things change. Whatever happened next would have a significant impact on the situation. The doors opened with a soft chime, and I stepped out into the hallway. My hands were shaking, but I forced myself to move forward, each step feeling heavier than the last. Then I saw it. I noticed her red heels, casually kicked off outside a door. I noticed her shoes. I stood there for a moment, looking at those shoes. My mind was racing, thinking about the sounds from the party, the messages, and the laughter. It all came together in a rather unpleasant way. I took a deep breath, raised my hand, and knocked on the door. The seconds seemed to stretch into an eternity. My heart was beating so fast that I could barely hear anything else. The hum of the hallway lights, the faint murmur of distant voices. For a moment, I thought they weren't going to answer. Maybe I'd scared them into staying silent. Then the door opened, and Bryce stood there, his shirt unbuttoned and his hair a little tousled, like he'd just stepped out of the shower. He looked calm, but his eyes showed he was uneasy. He said, "Can I help you?" The door opened, and Bryce stood there, his shirt unbuttoned and hair a bit disheveled, like he'd just stepped out of the shower. Ed, with a look of surprise on his face, asked, "Can I help you?" His voice was calm, but his eyes showed he was uneasy. I didn't respond. I looked past him into the room. That's when I saw her. Lauren. She was standing by the bed in one of those fluffy white robes you often see in hotels. "Eric," she said, sounding surprised. Her eyes got a little wider, but it wasn't because she was feeling guilty. I got the sense from her expression that I'd interrupted something she was doing that was a bit inconvenient. I clenched my fists at my sides. This is what a client meeting looks like. Bryce cleared his throat and stepped forward, trying to block my view of her. "This isn't what it looks like," he said. "Oh, come on." I said, "I've seen the texts. I've heard all the excuses. I know exactly what this is about." Lauren finally got up and walked over to the door, tying the robe tighter around her waist. "Eric, take it easy," she said, in a tone that was a little too patronizing. "You're making a scene here." "A scene," I repeated, my voice shaking with rage. "You're in a hotel room with him, and I'm the one causing a scene." She sighed and rubbed her temples, as if I were a child throwing a tantrum. "I'm not sure what you're doing here, but this isn't... Where should we have this conversation? I think it should be at home, where you can tell me to my face what you really think." Bryce stepped in again, trying to calm things down. "Hey, let's just talk this through." "Let's not do that." I pointed a finger at him. "You don't have the right to speak to me." Lauren rolled her eyes, and that was the end of it. That was the final straw. All the anger I'd been holding in finally came out. "How long has this been going on?" I asked. "How long have you been working behind my back?" She didn't respond. Instead, she crossed her arms and looked at me with that same cold indifference that had been creeping into her demeanor for months. "Eric, could you please speak a little quieter?" She let out a low hiss. It looked like a smile, but it wasn't warm or apologetic. It was a bit mocking. "You're so dramatic," she said, with a tone that was a little condescending. "This is why I didn't want to tell you. You don't handle things like an adult." Her words stung a bit. "Are you serious? Right now, you're blaming me." She gave a shrug, glancing at Bryce for a split second. It was a silent cue I couldn't ignore. "Take a look at yourself," she said. "You're coming in here like some jealous lunatic instead of trying to have a rational conversation." Rational is a pretty strong word, Lauren. What part of this is supposed to be rational? There was a tense silence for a moment. The impact of my words was tangible. Bryce shifted uncomfortably, as if he'd rather be anywhere else. Lauren, on the other hand, looked bored. It seemed like she was waiting for me to leave so she could get back to what she was doing. "I know you're busy, but I just wanted to say that I love you." Despite my best efforts to stay calm, I couldn't help but say it. "I had faith in you." Her expression didn't change. As a matter of fact, it hardened. "Maybe that's the issue," she said, in a rather cold tone. "You put too much trust in me. You didn't notice when I started to pull away. You didn't even try to work on it." Her words were like a knife to the heart. What made it worse was that she didn't seem to have any regrets. She wasn't sorry about it. I was so taken aback that I took a step back. I was in a bit of a daze. I muttered to myself, "You're unbelievable." Lauren let out another sigh, as if the whole situation was exhausting for her. Eric, just head home. Let's talk about this later when you're feeling calmer. I looked at her, trying to find any sign of the woman I thought I'd married. But she wasn't there. This Lauren, the one standing in a hotel room with another man, didn't apologize. I'd never seen him act in such a cruel manner before. I really hope he's worth it. I finally spoke up, my voice flat, and without waiting for a response. I turned and walked away, leaving the door open behind me. I don't recall driving home. My hands were gripping the steering wheel as if it were the only thing keeping me grounded, but my mind was elsewhere, stuck on that hotel room, replaying every word, every smirk, every cutting glance. Lauren was in my way. Her lack of interest was not just frustrating. It was infuriating. The way she acted like I was the problem, like I was being irrational for confronting her in the middle of her betrayal, it really bothered me. How had I missed this side of her for so long? When I pulled into the driveway, I just sat there looking at the darkened windows of our house, the one we'd spent years building together, filled with memories. It felt like I'd been written out of a play I wasn't aware I was in. I finally got myself out of the car and into the house. I got out of the car and went inside. The silence was pretty overwhelming. I wanted to scream and break something to show her how much chaos she'd caused me. Instead, I sat down on the couch with my head in my hands. That's when I started asking myself questions. Had I been blind to what was going on? Had I been so wrapped up in my own routine that I hadn't noticed her pulling away? Or was she just that good at keeping it a secret? The hours just seemed to drag by. The weight of the night was getting more and more intense with each passing minute. I thought about calling someone, maybe Jake, but I wasn't sure what to say. Hey, I just found out my wife has been sleeping with some guy named Bryce, I thought. Want to grab a beer? As the sun began to rise, I finally succumbed to exhaustion. I ended up having a restless night on the couch, dreaming about Lauren and Bryce. Their laughter seemed to echo in my dreams. When I woke up, it was already pretty late, and Lauren was... The car was back in the driveway. As I sat up, rubbing the sleep from my eyes, I felt my stomach tighten. She was back home. The kitchen smelled like coffee, and there she was, standing at the counter in one of her casual outfits, jeans and a loose sweater. She looked perfectly normal and like she belonged at home. It made me feel uneasy. "Morning," she said, not even looking at me as she poured herself a cup. I stared at her, taken aback. "Morning," she said, not even looking at me as she poured herself a cup of coffee. She finally turned to face me and sighed. "I don't think we should do this right now." "Too bad." I stood up abruptly, stating that we needed to get this done. "You don't get to walk in here and act like nothing happened." Lauren rolled her eyes and took a sip of her coffee. "You're being dramatic again. That's what you said last night." I replied, my voice rising when I learned you'd been caught in a hotel room with Bryce. Her expression became more serious, but she didn't deny it. "All right," she said, setting her mug down. "You want to talk? Let's talk this through." "That's great. Let's start with why I was clenching my fists." "Why him? Why am I even talking about this?" She crossed her arms and leaned against the counter because I was bored. "Eric, is that what you're looking for to hear?" The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I repeated, my voice shaking a little, that I was bored. "Yes, bored," she said, firmly. "You stopped trying. You got too comfortable. We lost our spark." Then Bright came along and got me feeling excited again. I was trying to keep my cool, but my jaw tightened. "I could have told you that," I said through gritted teeth. "We could have worked on it, but you decided to go in a different direction for him instead." Lauren's expression softened for a moment, but it wasn't regret. It was more like pity. "Eric, I didn't give up everything. I still have feelings for you, but they're not enough." Those 4 words really got to me. "Not enough," I repeated, my voice faltering. "I can't control how I feel," she said, as if that made it better. I took a step back and ran a hand through my hair. "Do you even realize what you're saying?" I said, laughing bitterly. "You love me, but it's not enough. You were bored, so you took the easy way out. Do you even realize how selfish that sounds?" She gave a shrug of her shoulders, which I found infuriating. "Maybe it is selfish, but at least I'm being honest now." I said the word, and it tasted bitter on my tongue. You think this is honesty after months of lying to me, going behind my back? Back her patience gave out. What do you want me to say, Eric? I'm sorry. I said it quietly. I'm sorry, but it doesn't change anything. No, I replied. My voice was low. It makes a big difference. We stood there in silence for a moment. The impact of her words and thoughts created a gap between us that seemed impossible to bridge. For the first time, I really understood. There was nothing we could do to fix this. I think it would be best if you left. I finally spoke up. My voice was calm and firm. Lauren's eyes opened a little wider. What did you hear? I said, get out. You can stay with Bryce or whoever you want, but you're not staying here. She looked at me, clearly taken aback. She hadn't expected me to actually stand up for myself like that. After a moment, she gave a little nod. I'll get my things, she said. As she walked past me, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Anger, sadness, and a strange sense of relief. This isn't over yet. Not by a long shot. But for now, I'd taken. The first step I took to start reclaiming my life was. Lauren left that afternoon. I watched from the window as she threw her overnight bag into the trunk of her car. She moved quickly and purposefully. There was no hesitation, no tearful goodbye, and no look back at the house we'd built together. She just drove off, leaving a trail of dust and a silence that felt more defining than any argument we'd had. I felt the emptiness hit me right away. I was standing in the middle of the living room, looking at the spot where her favorite throw blanket used to be. She took a few other personal items with her, too. A picture frame, a perfume bottle, and the coffee mug with the chip she always refused to replace. It was just a few small things, but they made a big impact. I wanted to feel like I could relate to her, but after all, I told her to leave. Instead, I felt empty inside. That night, the house felt too big. The kitchen clock was ticking away, and I couldn't stand it. So I yanked the batteries out. I tried watching TV, but every show seemed to have something I found irritating, like a smug couple holding hands or sharing some inside joke. I even found the weather report annoying. I ended up sitting in the dark with a glass of whiskey. My thoughts were all over the place the next morning. I woke up to a bunch of text messages. The first text I got was from Jake. He wanted to know if I'd heard anything. Then there was one from my mom. She had no idea about the chaos in my life. Hey, Mom, don't forget to bring dinner next Sunday. Bring Lauren along. She said she'd bring that spinach dip I love. I didn't respond to either of them. Instead, I just kept scrolling, hoping for something to take my mind off things. That's when I saw Lauren's post on Instagram. It was a photo of her at what looked like a swanky rooftop bar. She was smiling and holding a cocktail. The caption read, sometimes you have to step outside your comfort zone to find your true self. I looked at the screen, feeling disbelief turn into anger. She'd left me less than 24 hours ago, and now she was celebrating. Bryce had commented, "You deserve it, Bryce. You look great." I was overcome with nausea. She wasn't just moving on. She was showing it off for all to see. I threw my phone onto the couch and paced the room, my thoughts racing. Was this what she was aiming for? To shatter my life, and then parade her new one in front of me like some twisted victory lap? By mid-afternoon, Jake showed up unannounced. He let himself in, holding 2 beers. "I thought you might want these," he said, handing me one. "Thanks," I said, sinking down onto the couch. He sat across from me, opening his beer with a keychain opener. "So, what's the plan?" I looked at him, a little confused. "The plan is, you're not just going to sit here and stew, are you?" he said, leaning forward. I gave a shrug and took a long sip. "What else am I supposed to do?" Jake shook his head. "We can't let her get the upper hand, man. From your perspective, it seems like this is some kind of empowering journey. From my perspective, though, you're falling apart." I didn't respond. He wasn't wrong, but it all felt too much to deal with, let alone fight against. "I'm being completely serious," Jake went on. "You need to start thinking about what's next. It could be a lawyer, therapy, or even just a fling to get you out of this rut." The word lawyer got my attention. I hadn't even considered the legal implications yet. The house, the finances, it all felt like a secondary concern compared to the emotional impact. He was right, though. This wasn't just about feelings anymore. Maybe, I said, at last. Jake gave a dismissive look. Maybe, he said. But you don't think she's already planning her next move, do you? I didn't think so. Lauren was always strategic. If I don't act fast, I'll be the one left picking up the pieces while she walks away and is left with some serious egg on her face. I sat down to think things over. I got my laptop and started looking up divorce lawyers, asset division, and custody agreements. Even though we didn't have kids, the sheer complexity of it all was a bit overwhelming. I felt like I was drowning in a sea of legal jargon and worst-case scenarios. Just before midnight, I got an email from Lauren. The email subject line read, "About the house." I hesitated before opening it. I was feeling pretty uneasy. "Eric, I know things are a bit tense right now, but we need to talk about the practicalities. I'll stop by tomorrow to pick up the rest of my things." "I'll get the rest of my things. I think we should sell the house and split the proceeds. It's too big for just the two of us, and we both deserve a fresh start. Let me know if you want to talk in person or if you prefer to handle everything through email." Lauren. She was really polite and businesslike in her tone. It was a bit of a turnoff. It was like she was writing to a colleague, not the guy she just broke up with. I got up and closed the laptop with a bang. I couldn't bring myself to read it again. Tomorrow she'd be back, and whether I was ready or not, we'd be facing another challenge. The next day, I woke up feeling like I was gearing up for a fight. Lauren was back, and this time, I wasn't going to let her take control. She caught me off guard at the hotel, but this was my house, or at least it still felt like mine. I spent the morning walking back and forth and thinking about what I wanted to say. I went over every version of the conversation in my head. The calm and collected one, the passionate and assertive one, and even one where I asked her to think again. But I couldn't find a scenario that felt right. The truth was, I wasn't sure how I was going to react until she was standing in front of me at noon. I watched her pull up in her car and step out wearing sunglasses and a casual outfit, jeans and a fitted blazer, like she was heading to brunch instead of collecting the memorable moments from our time together. She knocked on the door, and I opened it before she could knock a second time. "Hi," she said. Her voice was neutral and almost detached. I stepped aside and motioned for her to come in. "Let's get this over with." She walked past me, leaving her perfume in the air. It used to be a source of comfort, but now it makes my stomach churn. Lauren didn't waste any time. She went straight to the bedroom, where I'd already started packing her things into boxes. "Thanks for packing," she said. Her tone was polite but a bit flat. She opened one of the boxes and started going through it as if she were checking my work. I leaned against the door frame and watched her. "You could have done this yourself," she said, glancing up. She gave a tight smile. "I didn't think you'd want me here longer than necessary," she replied. "You were right." I said it in a detached, impersonal way. She kept packing, moving quickly and efficiently. "Look, Eric, I don't want this to be more difficult than it has to be," she said, her tone lightening. Despite making things as difficult as possible, her hands froze for a moment, then she sighed and turned to face me. "I know you're upset. It's more than just angry." I spoke up. "You lied to me for months, Lauren. You cheated on me, and now you're acting like we're just dividing up office supplies." Her expression became more serious. "I'm not going to argue with you, Eric. It's over." I said, sounding pretty incredulous. No apology, no explanation at all. She just said, "It is what it is." She gave a shrug and her tone was cold. "I've already explained myself. I wasn't happy, and I found someone who really got me excited again. I'm not proud of how it happened, but I'm not going to dwell on it either." I felt my chest tighten with a mix of anger and heartbreak. It was starting to get the better of me. "You don't even care, do you?" "I've already done that," Lauren said, rolling her eyes. "Of course I care, but I'm not going to dwell on this just because you're having a hard time moving on." I looked at her, surprised by her boldness. "Move on," I repeated. "You destroyed my life, and now you're telling me to move on?" She picked up another box and started for the door. "I'm not going to do this," she said. "Eric, I came here to get my things, not to go over old issues." I stepped in front of her, blocking the door. "I'm not going anywhere. We're going to talk about this. You can't just walk away again." Her eyes flashed with irritation. and I saw a hint of frustration in her usually calm demeanor. "What do you want me to say, Eric?" she asked, a little snappishly. "I'm sorry." "All right, then. My apologies. I stayed in a marriage that wasn't working, and I'm sorry if that makes me the bad guy in your story, but I'm done pretending this can be fixed." Her words were a bit of a shock, but I'm standing my ground. "You think you're the one who's been wronged here. You think I'm the bad guy for trusting you, for loving you, for giving you everything I had." Lauren didn't respond right away. Instead, she took a deep breath. Her hands clenched around the box she was holding. "This isn't about who's to blame, Eric. It's about moving forward, and that's what I'm trying to do here." I stepped aside to let her pass. "Go ahead," I said, with a hint of bitterness in my voice. "Go to Bryce. Start anew, but don't come back here when it falls apart." She paused in the doorway, turning to look at me one last time. For a second, I thought I saw regret or hesitation in her eyes, but it was gone just as quickly as it had come. "Bye, Eric," she said quietly. Then she was gone, as her car disappeared down the street. I stood in the empty doorway, feeling the impact of her absence. I felt the weight of her absence like a heavy cloak. This was it, the end of the life we'd built together. But as I closed the door and locked it behind me, I had a new thought. Maybe her leaving wasn't just the end. Maybe it was the start of something better. The first night after Lauren left for good, the house felt really quiet. Everything seemed louder and more pronounced. The creaks of the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, even the distant sound of a passing car. The space felt different somehow. It felt like a waste of time. I sat at the dining table, looking at my laptop. I saw her email about selling the house. The cursor blinked at the end of her carefully worded email. There was too much space for either of us to work alone. I didn't respond. I just couldn't bring myself to engage with her on her terms. Not yet. Instead, I opened a new tab and entered "top divorce lawyers near me" into the search bar. The search results came up in a long list on the screen. Each name on the list promised expertise and efficiency. I wasn't sure if any of them were the right choice for me. This wasn't just about the paperwork. It was about dismantling a life. I kept scrolling until my phone buzzed on the table. It was a message from Jake. "Hey Jake, how are you holding up? Want to grab a drink?" I considered not responding. I wasn't in the mood to socialize, but I didn't want to be stuck in this empty house, lost in my thoughts. I grabbed my keys and texted back, "I'll be there in 15. Jake and I met at a small, local bar. It was one of those places that tried too hard to look rustic with fake wooden beams and overpriced craft beer. But tonight it was just what I needed. A place to sit, have a drink, and not think too much. "You look a bit rough," Jake said as I sat down opposite him in the booth. "Thanks," I said, flagging the waitress for a drink. Jake raised his glass, waiting for me to join him. When my beer arrived, I tapped it against his in a somewhat half-hearted manner. "It's time for a fresh start," he said with a smile. I rolled my eyes, but took a long drink. "It feels like things are coming to an end," I said. "Endings can be good," Jake replied, leaning back in his seat. "Sometimes you need to start from scratch before you can rebuild." I let out a little eye roll. "You sound like a motivational poster," Jake said, grinning. "Hey, somebody's got to keep you from going off the deep end." We sat in silence for a moment, the background noise of the bar filling the gaps in our conversation. Then Jake leaned forward, his expression serious. "What's the plan?" I said, looking into my drink. "We need to figure out the house, the finances, and all of it. I just don't even know where to start." "Start by remembering this isn't your fault," Jake said firmly. I looked up at him, surprised by the strength of his voice. "Eric, you didn't do this. She did. She made her choices, and yes, it's unfortunate, but you're the one who gets to decide what happens next. I'll let you get on with it." I felt like I was on the receiving end of Lauren's decisions, her lies, her betrayal, and her leaving. But maybe Jake was right. Maybe it was time for me to take the reins. When I got home that night, the house didn't feel quite as stifling. It was still empty, still filled with echoes of what it used to be like. But now there was a glimmer of something else, a tiny spark of hope, or maybe just determination. I sat down at the dining table and opened my laptop. and started writing my reply to Lauren's email. Lauren, if you want to sell the house, we'll handle it through the lawyers. I've had enough of pretending we can handle this amicably. You've made your decision, and I've made mine. Eric, it wasn't long, but it was enough. I hit send and closed the laptop, feeling a strange sense of relief. The next few days were a bit of a whirlwind, with meetings with lawyers, paperwork, and slowly starting to put the pieces of my life back together. Together, we found an old gym membership card buried in a drawer and decided to start going again, if only to burn off the restless energy that had been building since Lauren left. Then, one evening, I got a package at my door. It was a small package, wrapped in plain brown paper with no return address. I was curious, so I opened it to find a framed photo. It was a photo of Lauren and me from years ago, back when we were still happy. That was back when I thought we were unbreakable. There was a note tucked behind the photo, written in her handwriting. The handwriting was a bit messy, but I managed to make out the words, "I'm sorry." I looked at the note for a while, feeling a range of emotions: anger, sadness, and maybe even a hint of closure. She was sorry, but not sorry enough to stay or fight for what we had. I put the photo face down on the table and walked away, leaving it behind as if I was finally starting to move on from her. It didn't happen overnight, but there was a subtle shift in my life after Lauren left. The days started to feel less overwhelming. Things were returning to normal. I stuck to my routine, filling the gaps with gym visits, work, and the odd beer with Jake. The house was still too big and too full of memories, but I was learning to live with it. About a week after she left, I was in the middle of going through some old boxes in the attic when my phone buzzed. The phone screen lit up with an unfamiliar number. Normally, I'd let it go to voicemail, but something told me to pick up. "Hello," I replied, wiping the dust off my phone. Eric, the voice on the other end, was a little hesitant, but definitely familiar. I had to think for a moment to place it. "This is Eric," I said. There was a brief pause, and then she let out a sigh. "I wasn't sure if I should give you a call, but I think you need to know something." I felt a sudden tightening in my stomach. "What's up?" "It's about Bryce." She said her tone was serious. "Lauren." I sat down on an old trunk to steady myself. "Take a look." I wasn't sure I wanted to get involved, but Bryce has a history. He's been with a lot of women, married women, and he has a pattern. He sweeps them off their feet, makes big promises, and then moves on to the next one. I clenched my jaw in frustration. "So, you're saying Lauren is just another one of his conquests?" Stephanie took a moment to think. "I just want to give you a heads up. He's not the type to stay around for the long haul. When he's finished, she might come back to you." The thought sent a mix of anger, disbelief, and a strange, bitter vindication through me. "Why are you telling me this?" "I've seen this happen before." Bryce left her high and dry, humiliated, heartbroken, and completely blindsided. "I just wanted to give you a heads up in case things don't work out." "Thanks for the heads up. I appreciate it." "You're welcome. You're a good guy, so you deserve better than this." After we finished talking, I sat there for a while, looking up at the slanted beams of the attic ceiling. It was clear that Bryce's charm was nothing more than a weapon, and Lauren had fallen for it. But the worst part was worrying that she might come crawling back when she realized what she'd lost. I couldn't stop thinking, what would I do if she did? 2 days later, she came knocking on my door. It was almost midnight when I heard a soft knock at the door. I was on the couch, half asleep with a book in my lap, when I was startled by the sound. I opened the door and there she was. Lauren was standing on the porch, her makeup a little messy, her eyes red and puffy. She looked nothing like the self-assured woman who had left my life. She looked like she'd been through a lot. "Eric," she said, her voice trembling a bit. "What can I do to help?" I crossed my arms and leaned against the door frame, giving him a look that said I was ready for whatever he had to say. "I made a mistake." Her eyes filled with tears, but I stayed put. "I was an idiot," she said, her voice cracking. "I thought I was wrong about Bryce, but I wasn't. He wasn't being truthful with me. Turns out he was seeing someone else the whole time. I had no idea." I looked at her, feeling a mix of anger, pity, and a hint of satisfaction. "Now, you." "I know how it feels," I said quietly. Lauren flinched and a single tear rolled down her cheek. "Please, Eric. I'm not sure where else I can go." You've got plenty of other options. I took a step back, but this isn't one of them. Her expression changed, and she looked upset. Eric, please, I don't think that's a good idea. Lauren, I interrupted her. I spoke in a firm tone. You made your choices. You left that door open, and now you want to come back because things didn't work out with Bryce. That's not how this is supposed to work. It works, she said, covering her face with her hands for a second. I almost felt sorry for her, but then I remembered the hotel, the texts, and the way she'd looked at me like I was the problem. The pity vanished just like that. I hope you can figure things out, I said, stepping back inside. But this isn't the place for figuring things out. I closed the door and locked it, and her muffled cries faded as I walked away for the first time in weeks. I felt a strange sense of peace. This house is my life now, and for once, I'm finally in control of it. I didn't get much sleep that night after Lauren stopped by. My mind was flooded with emotions I hadn't experienced in weeks. I was still angry, but it was mixed with an overwhelming sense of relief. I'd finally stood up to her. I'd made a decision. The morning came with a crisp, clear start. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe again. I made coffee and sat by the window, watching the neighborhood slowly come to life. I couldn't stop thinking about Lauren's visit, but instead of getting me down, it felt like a turning point. Later that day, I got a call from Melissa, my lawyer. We've got the first draft of the property division agreement, she said. The house sale terms are pretty standard, but I just wanted to check before we proceed. Are you still sure you want to sell? I paused, looking at the walls around me. The house had been both a sanctuary and a prison. It was filled with memories, some good and some bad. Selling it would mean moving on from all of that, but maybe that was exactly what I needed. I finally decided to let it sell. Good decision, Melissa replied. This should help things move along more quickly. I'll give you a call after the meeting to let you know how it went. Even the bedroom, where it was now so quiet you could hear the silence, was a reminder of the house and the chapter of my life that it represented. It was time to wrap up that chapter. That evening, Jake stopped by with takeout and a six-pack. It had become our new normal. He was there to make sure I didn't spend too much time on my own. I had some big news to share, I said as he sat down on the couch. Jake replied, opening a beer. Tell me everything, he said. I'm selling the house. I was even more surprised by how calm I was. Jake was surprised at how calm I sounded. That's a big deal. You sure about this? Yes, I replied, nodding. I think it's time for a change. This place is just too much for me. I need to make a fresh start. That's great. So where are you planning to go? I'm still figuring that out. I'm looking for somewhere smaller, somewhere that's just mine. We spent the rest of the evening discussing potential options. I'm looking at apartments downtown and maybe a small bungalow on the edge of town. This was the first time I'd thought about moving. 2 days later, Lauren sent me another message. This time it was an email. Eric, I just wanted to thank you for listening to me the other night. Even if things didn't work out the way I'd hoped, I've been thinking a lot lately and I realize now that I took you for granted. You didn't deserve what I did, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life. I know I can't undo the damage, but I hope we can make it right one day. Lauren, I read the email twice, trying to make sense of what she was saying. I was torn. Part of me wanted to delete it immediately to cut her off completely, but another part of me, the part that still remembered the good times, felt a strange sense of closure. She'd admitted she was sorry, even if it was too late to matter, and maybe that was enough. I didn't respond. Instead, I flagged the email as urgent and closed my laptop. The next few weeks were a flurry of paperwork and planning. Melissa helped wrap up the house sale, and I started looking at apartments. It was a bit overwhelming at first, but with each step I took, I felt a little more at ease. One day, while packing up some old boxes, I came across a photo album that Lauren and I had put together during our first year of marriage. It was full of photos from happier times. Our honeymoon, birthdays, lazy Sundays on the couch. I flipped through the pages, letting the memories wash over me. Of course, there was sadness, but there was also a strange sense of gratitude for those moments. I closed the album and put it in a donation box. I didn't need to keep it with me anymore. On the day the house sold, I stood in the empty living room, taking one last look around. It was a strange feeling to see the house stripped of all its furniture, decorations, and personal touches. But it wasn't ours anymore, as the saying goes. It was just a house, after all. I locked up, put the keys in an envelope for the new owners, and left. I finally started to feel like I was settling into my new reality. After Lauren's late-night visit, I'd been trying to find a way to move on from the house for about 3.5 weeks. I decided to sell, and Melissa was taking care of the legal side of things. I was on the hunt for my next place and a fresh start. I'd been checking out apartment listings, picturing myself in a smaller, more straightforward space. I was looking for a place with no ghosts lurking in the corners. I went through the usual back and forth with the real estate emails. I saw a notification on my phone. It wasn't a number I recognized, but I answered anyway. "Hello, Eric," I said. I could hear her breathing on the other end. "What can I help you with?" I asked her. I spoke in a firm but calm tone. She took a moment to collect herself, and I could hear her breathing. "I know you don't owe me anything," she said at last. "I just wanted to chat, if you're up for it." I didn't get angry or involve lawyers. Instead, I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. My gut was telling me to end the call. She didn't deserve my time or energy, but I stayed on the line. "Why now?" I asked, but my voice came out colder than I meant it to. "I'm not sure," she said. "I suppose I'm just trying to understand how we got to this point." I let out a laugh that was a little bitter. "You're joking, right? You're not sure how we got to this point." "I made some mistakes along the way," she said. She sounded defensive. "I know that, but I wasn't the only one involved." "Eric," I was pretty upset when she said that. "Oh, so now you're trying to blame me for this?" I lost my cool. "You were the one who was going behind everyone's back. You were the one who caused the rift between us. Don't act like I had anything to do with this." "I'm not blaming you," she said quietly. "I just don't think it was ever as perfect as we thought it was." I stood up and walked around the room. "So what? That justifies everything, I suppose. You were bored, so you decided to cheat instead of talking to me or trying to fix things. You just latched onto the first guy who showed you some attention." Lauren didn't respond immediately when she finally spoke. Her voice was a little shaky. "That's not what happened, Eric. I was feeling lost, and Bryce helped me feel like I mattered again. I know that sounds selfish, and it was, but it wasn't about you. It was about me, personally." Her words hit me like a gut punch. I wanted to yell and tell her off, but instead I sat down and took a deep breath. "You could have let me know. You could have let me know. Anything at all. You could have given me a heads up instead of blindsiding me like this." I was worried. I was worried about how you'd react. I was worried that I might hurt you. And in the end, I ended up hurting you even more. I know that for a moment, I was angry, but then that anger faded, and I felt something else, but I couldn't quite put a name to it. Was it pity? Is there any way I can get closure on this? I had no idea why she was calling me Lauren. I asked her to explain what she meant. She took a moment to collect her thoughts, and I could see her struggling to find the words. She said, "I need you to know that I did care about you." She said she still cared about me, even though she didn't have the right to say that anymore. I listened to her words, closing my eyes as she spoke. Take a moment to process this. There was a time when I would have done anything to hear them, but now they feel a bit empty. "Lauren, this is too little, too late." I said it calmly. "I appreciate you saying that, but it doesn't change anything. It's in the past. We're done." She didn't argue or get upset. She just let out a shaky breath. "I know," she said. "I'm sorry, Eric, for everything." There wasn't anything else to say. I ended the call and put my phone down on the table. I felt like I could finally put Lauren behind me. I wasn't resentful, just decisive. She was part of my story, but she wasn't the main plotline anymore. As the day drew to a close, I opened my laptop and started searching for apartments again. I was looking for something new and different. I wanted to start anew. About a month later, I was standing in the doorway of my new apartment. Jake was holding a box labeled kitchen stuff in his sloppy hand. The space wasn't much, just a small one-bedroom on the edge of downtown, but it was mine. Jake put another box down by the couch and looked around, nodding in approval. "Not bad," he said. "It's got a bit of a bachelor vibe, but I'm sure you'll make it work." I couldn't help but smile. "That's the idea, right? Jake replied, opening a bottle of beer he'd brought as a housewarming gift. So this is it. A fresh start, a clean slate, something like that, I said, taking a seat on the floor next to the coffee table. The apartment was still mostly empty, but that felt like the right way to do it. It wasn't filled with memories of Lauren or the weight of what could have been. It was a clean slate, waiting for me to figure out who I was and what I wanted to do with my life. Here's to moving on from the past, Jake said, raising his beer. I tapped my bottle against his and didn't look back that night. Once Jake had gone, I got on with unpacking in silence. I could hear the city outside, with cars beeping their horns, people chatting, and a distant hum of music. It was a change from the quiet suburban life I'd left behind, but I found it comforting. I took a photo frame out of its packaging and looked at it for a while. It was a photo of me and Lauren on our wedding day, smiling for the camera with our friends and family around us. I thought about getting rid of it, but then I took the photo out of the frame and put it at the back of a drawer. I wasn't trying to erase the past. I was making room for the future. Over the next few weeks, I started rebuilding my life bit by bit. I started going to the gym more often, not just to take my mind off things, but because it felt good. I also reached out to old friends I'd lost touch with. I met up with them for coffee or drinks, and it was great to catch up in ways I hadn't expected. It stopped feeling like a grind and started feeling like a focus for the first time in years. I threw myself into it, not just to get away, but because I wanted to do well. My colleagues noticed the change, and I noticed it too. One day, while grabbing a coffee at a local cafe, I bumped into a woman who dropped her notebook as I rushed past. "Sorry about that," I said, bending down to pick it up. "No problem," she replied with a warm smile. Her name was Claire, and she was sitting at a corner table working on something that looked like graphic design. I apologized again, but we ended up chatting for a few minutes. There was something about her that felt refreshing. No pretense, no games, just an easygoing conversation. Before I left, she gave me her business card with a smile. "The next coffee's on me," she said. I didn't call her right away. I wasn't ready for anything serious, and I wasn't sure if I ever would be. But the interaction stuck with me as a reminder that life goes on, and there are still people out there worth meeting and getting to know. As time passed, I thought less and less about Lauren. Her time in my life was over, and while I still had the scars, they didn't define me anymore. I wasn't fully healed, but I was on the mend. I wasn't fully healed, but I was building something stronger. It had been a long time since I'd been looking forward to what was next.